So far as we've examined the concept of regeneration, we've seen that regeneration is necessary, that it's mysterious, that it's a beginning of the Christian life, and that it is sovereign, that it represents the first point of the Christian experience. Now, in this segment, what I want to consider is this proposition that regeneration is immediate. I write on this blackboard or green board in fear and trembling because the last time, if you recall, I wrote the regeneration precedes faith, and everybody told me afterwards of what a terrible speller I am, that I misspelled precedes. And I said to the people, don't you know how to spell precedes? And I talked them into it. I convinced them that they didn't know how to spell precedes and that there was a new modern edition of how to do it. But no, I misspelled the word on the blackboard, and some people were surprised at that, but I wasn't. Nor was my spelling teacher from junior high surprised either. But anyway, I think I have this one right, that regeneration is immediate. Now, there's a little glitch here. When I say that regeneration is immediate, what pops into your mind? What does the word immediate mean to you? Instantly or suddenly. I can remember when my mother would tell me to do something, she would say, son, I want you to come in from the yard for dinner. And that was one way of calling me into dinner. And she would say that a couple times. Son, come on in for dinner. Come on in for dinner. And then when it reached the crescendo, it would be, young man, get in this house immediately. And every syllable was accented in my mother's coming. Get in here immediately. That meant right now, pronto gusto, don't waste any time. Now, immediate usually is used in our language with respect to time, meaning right away. But that's not how I'm using the term here. When I say that regeneration is immediate, I mean by that it is without means, without an intervening medium. Now, I'll try to explain that more closely in one moment, but first let me confuse you totally. Even though I am not using the term regenerate or immediate to refer to time and suddenness, I must also say, however, that regeneration is, in fact, instantaneous with respect to time. Let me say it again. Even though the word immediate with respect to regeneration does not refer to time, nevertheless, we would say that regeneration is immediate or instantaneous with respect to time. Now, that may puzzle you because I've said already in this series that some people have a sudden, instantaneous conversion experience, while others have a very gradual, drawn-out conversion experience where they can't tell you the year in which they became a Christian. They say, I don't know when it happened. It was over a gradual thing, over many, many years. Well, let's probe that a little bit. When I use the term conversion experience, I'm referring to that which we are aware of. An experience is something about which we are conscious. And I can say, I was conscious. My consciousness of becoming a Christian was sudden and abrupt and instantaneous. Where another person would say, you know, I just had a gradual awareness. And so we distinguish between our personal consciousness of what God is doing within us and what that action is itself. Last night, for the second time, I saw the film Crocodile Dundee. And when this fellow from Australia is met by this New York reporter from Newsday, she asks Crocodile Dundee back in the walkabout in the bush, she said, how old are you? And he said, I don't know. She said, you don't know? How could you not know? And he said, well, I asked the chief of the tribe that knew me when I was born. I said, Chief, when was I born? And the chief said, in the summer. So Crocodile Dundee didn't know when he was born. Well, there are lots of people that don't know when they're born again. But does that mean that Crocodile Dundee didn't have a birthday? No, of course he had a birthday. There was a time when he was unborn, and there was a time when he was born, and that differential is instantaneous. You're either born or you're not born. You're either dead or you're alive. There is that razor's edge line of demarcation between the two states. Now, a person cannot be aware of when or how he became born again. And it's not important to know when you became a Christian. That's not the issue. The issue is not when did you become born again or how did you become born again, but the only question that matters is, are you reborn? That's the question. But the actual work of God is instantaneous. You're either dead or you're alive to the things of God. There's no in between here. This is a genuine either-or situation. You're either regenerate or not regenerate. It's like pregnancy. No one is almost pregnant. And no one is almost regenerate. You either are or you aren't. I mean, the rabbits don't sit around and debate about it for 3 or 4 weeks while they're trying to figure out. So it is instantaneous, but when I am saying that regeneration is immediate, I'm saying more than to say that it's instantaneous. That when God brings you to spiritual life, He doesn't use any means apart from Himself to do it. When a doctor treats you for a disease and he gives you medicine, the medicine is the means that the doctor is using to bring about your recovery. The cure for spiritual death and spiritual deadness, the cure of regeneration, is not administered in doses, nor is it administered by means. The great physician heals you directly and immediately. Now let me give a biblical record of a different kind of way by which Jesus worked with people, and use this not to illustrate the same thing, but to illustrate the contrast. I'm thinking of the story that is found in the 8th chapter of the book of Mark, where we read in the 22nd verse this record. And they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him, and they entreated him to touch him. So this blind man is brought to Jesus, and whoever it is that brings this blind man to Jesus is begging Jesus, Jesus, please touch him. Obviously, these people are caring about their friend, and they've heard about the miraculous activity of Jesus. They want to see their friend benefit from His supernatural power, so they bring him there to see Jesus. And look what Jesus does. And taking the the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village. Picture that. Usually when Jesus heals somebody, somebody comes along and says, "Jesus, have mercy upon me, Son of David," and so on. He says, "I will, do, boom, go in peace." He heals them, it's all over. But here this blind man is brought out into the public, and the scriptures tell us that instead of Jesus healing him right there on the spot, instead he takes the man away from the crowds, away from being a public spectacle. And Jesus leads him by the hand. Now you talk about tender grace. Grace was never more tender than that, where God incarnate takes a blind man by the hand and leads him into privacy. Talk about concern for somebody's dignity. I wonder how many times that man had been led around by a friend. They didn't have seeing eye dogs. They didn't have electronic canes for a blind person in the ancient world. But imagine, he's being led down the street. He can't see where they're going. He has to trust the person who has his hand. Because the warning in Scripture is, you don't let the blind lead the blind, because if the blind lead the blind, they both fall in a ditch. And if the person who's being led, just think of how helpless you are, where your every step is controlled by another person. And that person can do anything they want to you, as long as you're under the supervision of their leading. But this man was being led by Christ. I mean, he never had a more certain, a more trustworthy guide in his entire life as he had that day. And here's Jesus, on the other hand, acting like a guide dog for this human being who's been oppressed by disease. But the scriptures say Jesus takes him by the hand and leads him. And then it says this: he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands upon him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" Now, I've just labored the point that Jesus bends over backwards to protect this blind man's dignity. And as soon as he gets them away from the watching crowd, what does he do? He spits in his eye. I mean, that is, in our culture, a gesture of insult designed to humiliate. But obviously, that was not the intent of Jesus. When Jesus spits in the eye of the blind man, he is expressing his communication and his touch with the man. If anybody's going to spit in my eye, let it be Christ. Because I would treasure the saliva of Jesus as long as I live if he would but spit in my eye. But he spits here in this man's eyes and then touches him and asks him, "Do you see anything?" Now this is very similar to the other account where we're told in another occasion where Jesus is healing a blind man that Jesus also uses spit, but he doesn't spit in the man's eyes. Jesus takes dirt and he turns the dirt into mud by applying spittle to the earth and turning it into mud, and then puts these pieces of mud on the man's eyes and heals him. Now what in the world do we have here in the Bible? Are these some kind of home remedies that Jesus' mother taught him back in Nazareth to cure blindness? That it almost sounds like voodoo, doesn't it? Where Jesus is fooling around with spit and mud and that kind of stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, there was absolutely no therapeutic power in that dirt or in that spit. Why Jesus goes through this, I have no idea. But I know this, he didn't need to give that man his sight back. And that the power to restore his vision was not in the spit, it was not in the mud, it was in the power of God. It wasn't in the means. And even though Jesus used means in behalf of the blind man, nevertheless, the power to restore his sight was immediate. Was the cure immediate in the sense of time? Look what happens. Very, very strange. Jesus spits in his eyes, lays his hands upon him, and then he asks them this question, do you see anything? What do you see? And the man opens up his eyes, and he said, I see men as trees walking around. I see men as trees walking. Now let me just stop myself here for a second and just say, would that man have been satisfied with that? He couldn't see men as anything walking prior to this encounter with Christ. He had never, well, we don't know whether he had never seen, but we know that he couldn't discern the difference between day and night, the difference between trees and men. This man saw nothing. Now, at least, he sees these vague, shadowy forms in motion. I see people, but they look like trees. I've never seen men who look like trees. I've seen trees that look like men. There was a great big one behind Wiggles Grocery, this giant oak tree that was there in my hometown. And every night, after dark, in the moonlight, I had to go through this path in this woods behind Wiggles Grocery Store to get to my street, McClellan Drive, to go home. And every night, I would look up, and I could see the silhouette of this tree, this massive tree that looked like it had 100 hostile arms that it was going to just reach out. I used to run by that tree. I really did, because it was a tree that looked like a man. I've never seen a man look like a tree. I've seen men that look like mountains,